All right, having issues with my phone, but hopefully this will work. So, I had a question from Matt in your class concerning the teachings of Luther and Calvin and how they line up to Baptist views. So, generally speaking, when we talk about Calvin, when people talk about Calvin in doctrinal sense, they usually are thinking of his views of predestination. So, the topic of predestination really comes up with Augustine in his anti-Pelagian works, which we dealt with last term. And predestination as a doctrinal discussion really only takes place in Western Christendom. So Roman Catholicism and all of its offspring deal with that. Everybody in the West, they are either agree with Augustinian predestination or argue against it, but it's a topic. So this manifests itself today in what is often Calvinism versus Arminianism, which I'll explain in a second. A couple of things that need to be defined at the beginning. Whenever you have a discussion on predestination and free will, predestination can be defined one of two ways. So the Augustinian view of predestination, which would be the Lutheran view and the Calvin view, is that God chooses who will be saved, all right, through no act on the believer's behalf. Those who are saved because God chooses them. Verses they would use for this would be Romans 7, John 6, Ephesians 1 and 2. So it's not an unfounded position. And before I go further, I will say that the predestination free will discussion has been going on for 1,600 years. And so don't think you're going to be able to settle this once and for all. There's even a middle term, a middle view called Molinism, which came up in the late 15, early 1600s, that is making a recurrence, that's trying to find a middle way between the two. So the other definition of predestination is that God knows who will choose him, and so based on God's foreknowledge are those who are predestined. So that would be the idea that God looks through all of history and knows that Joe will choose him, therefore Joe is predestined. All right. When it comes to free will, there are two views of free will. All right. So first of all, every Christian has to believe in predestination because the word occurs in the Bible. It's how do you interpret it. Every Christian ought to believe in free will, but it's how you define it. So for some, free will is you are free to do what you want to do. For others, free will is you are free to do what you ought to do. And there's a big difference there. So free will that means you can do what you want to do will be the type of free will that will be used by an Augustinian, Lutheran, Calvin, which means that everybody's free to do what they want to do and nobody wants God. So nobody on their own will be saved. Only God can save them. For an Arminian view, which would be throughout the Middle Ages held by semi-Pelagians, Erasmus, and then later with John Wesley of the Methodists, it's you are free to do what you ought to do, which means you should obey God's commands and you should be able to choose God. So an Arminian position, the idea that you can choose to be saved would be based on all of the commands in the Bible that say to do something. It insinuates that you have the ability to do it. And again, we go right back to the Augustinian Pelagian argument. So that being said, when we get to Luther and Calvin, Luther is an Augustinian monk. He is building on Augustine's view, which will come through people like Gottschalk in 800 AD. You will see it with Aquinas to a degree. You will see it in Thomas Bradwardine, Gregory of Rimini, John Wycliffe. So you have this view of predestination, an Augustinian view that goes right there to Luther, and then to Zwingli, and to Calvin. So for Luther, the idea of predestination was a great comfort because his whole life, right, or once he got to the monastery, he is trying to do good. He is trying to obey God. He is trying to be justified and righteous. And he couldn't. And when he read Romans 1:17, and all of a sudden he was like, oh, I get it. Salvation is based upon God's righteousness being put upon me. Christ's righteousness is put upon me. And for Luther, the idea that God chooses who will be saved takes all the pressure off of the believer, so that if you are saved, you can now rest in your salvation and then do works that are truly good because they are done of your own volition, out of a love for God and love for neighbor. So for Luther, predestination, and it'd be the same for Calvin, predestination is a wonderful thing because it means the pressure is not on you. So you are now free to love God and love man. For Luther, the other view would be, I have to try to keep myself saved. I have to try to do works that make sure I am saved. How will I know when I've done enough? And then what is the motivation for my good works? Are my good works to get me saved, to help me stay saved, or are they out of love of neighbor and love of God? So for Luther, and for Calvin as well, predestination was a wonderful comfort. So you have to keep that in mind. A couple of things that attacks against Calvinism, again, that's what I'll call this. It's really a form of Augustinian. But so if we look at Calvinism, one of the attacks is they say if somebody is predestined by God, then they're not going to do good works. They're just going to live riotous and drunk and everything else. A Calvinist would respond that those who are truly saved seek to obey God and would not behave in such a manner. All right. Another argument that you will see against Calvinists is that they have no motivation to evangelize. But a Calvinist would say, when you read the Bible, it says we have to share the gospel, and this is the means by which God reveals to other people their salvation. All right, so a true Calvinist would believe that you have to evangelize, and that a true Christian will live as a Christian. All right, so get that out of the way, because that's usually the arguments that are just thrown at Calvinists. And if you've had me in class before, you know that my main concern is that the Arminians and the Calvinists can be friends, and I'll explain that in a little bit. So let me just get those things out of the way with Calvinism. So when we talk about Calvinism today, there are 5 points of Calvinism. Modern Calvinists will often alter these, but the traditional 5 views were created or not created, but laid out at the Synod of Dort in 1619. So Calvin dies in 1564, and Calvin himself does not lay out, here are the 5 points of Calvinism. It's mainly his followers, and in particular a guy by the name of Theodore Beza, who takes Calvin's works and kind of reduces them to these 5 points. And it's not all of Calvin's works. If you read his Institutes, which I would recommend anybody to get, if you can pick up a copy of Calvin's Institutes, you can get them free online, right? But if you can actually get the hardback copy cheaply, I say do it, because even if you disagree with Calvin on issues, he really does great scholarly work. When it comes to predestination, he spends maybe, I think, 11 pages out of a work that's over 1,500 pages. So Calvin is saddled with this view of predestination that he really did not spend a lot of time on, but his followers do. So in the whole idea of Calvinism, and just like with Augustinianism, causes some problems. You have discussions and debates. There's a man by the name of Jacob Arminius in the late 1500s who opposes the Calvinist view of predestination and argues against it, and his followers take his views, and they're called Arminians. So in 1619, the Synod of Dort is called in the Netherlands to settle this dispute. And that's where we get these 5 points from. So the 5 points of Calvinism have an acronym, right? TULIP. All right, you're in the Netherlands. They have lots of tulips. That's what they come up with. So TULIP. And I'll say what they are first, then I'll explain them. So the T stands for total depravity. The U stands for unconditional election. The L stands for limited atonement. The I stands for irresistible grace. And the P stands for perseverance of the saints. And what this means is, total depravity means basically that mankind is sinful, and on their own they cannot choose God. All right, that's really it, right? A person is unable to choose God. The second one is unconditional election. That means those who are saved, those that God chooses, are chosen through nothing good within them. So those people that God chooses are chosen. We don't know why. And you can look to the Old Testament and see somebody like Abraham. Why was Abraham chosen? I don't know. Why was Israel chosen? I don't know. Like, God just makes this decree. So a Calvinist would say, you look through the Bible, why was this person chosen? Why was Paul chosen instead of any other Pharisee? God just chooses this. We don't know why, and it is through nothing of them. If it was something within them, then they would say it's not really grace, it's somehow earned. All right, because they've done something to deserve to be chosen. The L stands for limited atonement, and that is usually the most controversial of the Calvinist points. The limited atonement means that Christ died only for the elect. All right, that Christ, his death is only for Christians. That'd be a great paper topic if you want to investigate that and dig through it. That's a great one because there's a lot of nuances depending on who you are and how you interpret that. The classic view is that straight up. There are some modified views that will say Christ's death is available to all but effective only for the elect, basically meaning Christ died for everyone, but only the elect are going to make that choice, or it's only going to affect them. Again, that's not true 5-point Calvinism. You might call that 4.5 point or something else. And you see that with Peter Lombard in the 1100s actually says that Christ's death is, he doesn't say available, I forget the word, but it's basically Christ's death is available to everybody, but only the elect is it going to be effective for, right? They're the only ones that it's going to apply for because the other people aren't going to choose Christ because they can't choose Christ in a Calvinist setting. I is irresistible grace. This basically means if you are one of the elect, there's nothing you can do to not be elect. You will accept God's grace. And the P is perseverance of the saints, which means those who are truly saved will stay saved. And they get that from 1 John where it says those that were with us were not truly of us because they departed from us. So they would say anybody that seems to be a Christian and then leaves was never truly a Christian. All right. So those are the 5 points of Calvinists. They are very philosophically coherent. I'm not saying they're all necessarily that's the actual biblical model, right? I'm not going to try to push one of these views on the other. I will say that you can find support for all 5 of those views in the Bible. You can find support for all of the 5 views of Arminianism in the Bible, right? I think some are much clearer in one direction than another. But you can find verses and say, I think this verse means this. And then you'll have maybe the other side will have a lot of verses that suggest otherwise. But this has been kicked around for 1,600 years because of that, right? This isn't like, oh, here's this verse, it's over and done, right? Then somebody will be like, what about this verse? And even though you will be, well, I don't agree that that's a proper interpretation, but it's there. So conversely, the Arminian view would be the opposite. So instead of total depravity, they would say basically partial depravity. They don't have a nice acronym. Acronym, that's the word I'm looking for. They don't have a nice acronym for their side. But total depravity, they would have, you're not completely depraved. You can choose God. You can choose Christ. Then unconditional election, they would say it's based upon something, right? You do something to be one of the elect. Instead of limited atonement, it's unlimited atonement. Christ's death is available to everybody. Of course, not everybody's saved. Only those who accept Christ or choose Christ will be saved. What's that? T-U-L-I, irresistible grace. Grace is resistible. God's grace is basically available to everybody, and you can reject that because those who are not saved have rejected it. And then instead of perseverance of the saints, you can lose your salvation. And that would be based on the idea that if you can choose Christ, you can unchoose him. So they're philosophically consistent. Many people fall somewhere in between them. Southern Baptists are notorious for just picking whichever 5 they like. All right. So many Southern Baptists believe that you can choose Christ, but you can't lose your salvation. So choosing Christ of your own volition is an Arminian view. Not losing your salvation is a Calvinist view. So those are the 5 views of each in a nutshell. So the Calvinist view, the tulip, is held by Reformed and their offspring. So in classic denominational form, the Reformed would be Presbyterians, old school Congregationalists that basically don't exist anymore, the Puritans, Jonathan Edwards and them. Congregationalism, basically, they don't exist. And then large portions of Baptists. Some Anglicans originally were. Arminians are going to be many modern Anglicans, Methodists, and Pentecostals, right? That's basically your breakdown. Catholics, I'm not going to worry about them at the moment. I don't really know what they would say on some of those. So I had to think about that a little more. So that's the views. Those are the views that are held. So neither view, you can hold to any of those five, and you are not a heretic, right? They are all orthodox views. And we have to think about them for a second, what the end goal is. The end goal is preaching the gospel, and here's why. If you are an Arminian, and you believe people can freely choose Christ, then what do? You preach the gospel. Then they can make a choice. If you believe people are predestined, that God chooses who will be saved, then you preach the gospel so that those people can recognize their election. You would never phrase it that way. Hey, here's the gospel. Recognize your election. But you preach the gospel so that then people hear the gospel, because that's how people get saved. So in either model, the gospel is preached. And over the last 30 years, basically Calvinism, there's not a lot of Calvinism going on in the United States, certainly in the Baptist circles from the 1800s until 1980s. And then there's been a resurgence, and there's a lot of Baptists that don't like that, because they're like, Calvinism, nobody's going to preach the gospel. I chose. No, God didn't choose me, right? And that's really bad, right? Because it's a bad argument, and it really doesn't understand what Calvinism is. So most Southern Seminary, which is the preeminent Southern Baptist seminary, is incredibly Calvinistic. All right, you have various churches, more and more, that are Reformed Baptist within the Southern Baptist Convention. So I always tell my students, don't get hung up on these things. Recognize there's differences and then preach the gospel. All right, that's the main thing. So I don't like it when people are anti one or the other, because I think you're doing a disservice to the church as a whole and our representation and the preaching of the gospel. I kind of liken it like this. It's an internal discussion that Christians can have, and it's good to have because it forces us to go back to Scripture. But to me, it's like we would say, or we're going to go to the SEC, the Southeastern Football Conference. And we would say the SEC is the best football conference in American college football. All right, we could all agree with that. Well, hopefully. Maybe you don't, but let's just say you do. And within the SEC, you might say, well, Alabama is the best. You might say Georgia's the best. And you have this debate over which one's better, or Auburn or LSU or whatever. But then outside, you would agree and say, hey, but we both agree the SEC is the best. So we all agree the gospel needs to be preached. How people are saved, that's an internal discussion that is okay to have. As long as we remember at the end of the day, the gospel has to get preached. So I'll do another, I have to change the laundry, and then I'll do one on some Baptist history just to kind of clarify this.